communities, the electric aerial revolution. Quick intro, Kate, and then Clint.
I'm Kate McCauley. I'm a senior regional planner at San Diego Association of Governments, or SANDAG as we're more commonly known. And I will pass it over to Clint.
And I'm Clint Harper. I'm an aviation infrastructure and policy advisor with Harper 4D Solutions. I pair a 27-year career in aviation, which was mostly in infrastructure with a degree in urban planning and design, and work with communities to help them prepare for advanced air mobility.
Content, just click below. I'm Chuck Martin, and welcome to the AAMA website.
I think that with the federal government coming out and pretty much saying that they anticipate that a lot of future infrastructure build will be public-private partnerships, it also is helping better to define what that ownership is supposed to look like, but still there are questions around that. What does that look like? For a lot of jurisdictions who don't have a public-private partnership program or understand what that really means, is that going to make it longer in order to be able to integrate this technology? Because again, public-private partnerships is also fairly innovative in terms of planning too. So I think that having well-defined ownerships, I think back to Clint's point in policymaking on all of these things, it's trying to find that happy medium of who owns what, who's going to take on what, and is that a harmonious, well understood plan of attack in order to make sure that you can really start your implementation processes?
So that brings us back to the whole issue of readiness. Is the market ready? Is the public ready? I mean, you're both dealing with the public a lot, especially you, Kate. Do you find that just the normal people, as opposed to the people you deal with, know what's coming?
No, not at all. Even with drone delivery. So again, in a past life, I worked for a drone delivery company, and
it's Wing. Come on, you know that.
Yes, I used to work for Wing Drone Delivery. And often I would go to these public outreach events, and people would say, "Okay, well, I'm going to shoot that out of the sky," and I'd be like, "You don't want to do that. It's federally frowned upon, and also federal offense, so don't do it." But people have concerns about noise. They have concerns about all sorts of things, privacy. And so people come out and they say, "Oh, well, what about this? And what about this?" And it's like, until they get to see it in operation, until you get to see it and feel it and hear it and all of these things, you're kind of working against the grain. And so it's hard where the rubber meets the road, because you don't want to be so proactive that you're going into these communities and it's now, again, you're combating misnomers and misunderstandings around the technology, but you want to get ahead of it enough so that once it is ready to be deployed to that area, everyone is excited about it, or they get the opportunity to go out and they see it. And so outreach is such a delicate balance of knowing when, where, and how, and what messaging. I think that goes back again to speaking the same language, but having a unified messaging, making sure that you are planning really well with the technology providers. So if you didn't know, Wing just announced that they're going to come to San Diego. We happen to have a couple weeks notice on that, which is great. But if you happen to see other technologies, let's say AV technology, who sometimes they just decide a market and they're going to deploy, and they don't do community outreach, or they don't do stakeholder outreach with the governments. And then all of a sudden you have people who are combating your technology. Now you have to react to your community instead of proactively working alongside them for your integration process. So, again, it's trying to find that delicate balance, but it's so important, again, that you have the messaging, you're working alongside your technology providers, and that your governments understand exactly what's coming and how, kind of to anticipate what that reaction might be.
Clint, you're working with these champions basically. Do you see that they have to go deal with the market and you just kind of stay behind the scenes, low key, or do you get involved in that as well?
Yeah, I wish I was more, behind the scenes and low key, but everything, Kate's saying is absolute gold, and then so I hope everybody's, taking, copious notes, on all of this, because, there's so many different voices, that are shaping the conversation right now, and so many more voices that haven't even engaged in the conversations yet, and so when we look at the different flavors of what deployment's going to look like, it could be a public-private partnership, it could be a private development, or it could be a completely public development. Every single one of those paths, is a different journey, it's going to take you down a different journey, all kind of meeting at the same end, at the end of the day. But that is also going to help you define readiness, and so you just kind of go back to all that. There's resources, that are going to be allocated, no matter what path you take. Those resources might be spent on developing a development code, to guide public or private developers on how to develop a vertiport or a drone port within your community. It could be, on legal services to define what a public-private partnership is going to look like, there, and how that's going to work. Or it could be into developing the actual facility yourself. And so all of those, there is, I think, something that isn't fully appreciated, in the industry. If we're using, public money or public resources, there's a certain extent of public accountability that has to go with that. And it's not just as easy as some of the media headlines will say, well, infrastructure is a bottleneck, so cities must do this, or communities must start doing this. Well, no, they mustn't. It's not your call to say what the cities are going to do. They have priorities. You can go and look at city council minutes, planning commission minutes. You can see what the things week to week and month to month that they're dealing with and the priorities. And oftentimes they're much heavier than advanced air mobility, especially if what they're viewing is a niche mode of transportation for the wealthy, when they have homelessness, transportation inequities, food insecurity to deal with. And so that's why we try and get those conversations started within the communities early to say, what are your pain points? Because they might be food insecurity. Getting whole, healthy foods to food deserts, might be one of their main issues. And they never even thought about using drones or an advanced air mobility technology. Maybe they're doing something different. And so to open that conversation up to really understand how advanced air mobility can serve that region, you got to start framing it, within the context of the things that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Because otherwise, you might be looked at, and this, isn't necessarily a fair comparison, but it is a real perspective that you're diverting funds and resources away from something as critical as the housing crisis to provide a mode of transportation for the rich and wealthy. And once you have established, that kind of dynamic, it's very hard to back out of that and create a new narrative. So it's of almost important to create that narrative early on, that we're trying to, position this in a helping way.
Interested in the two of you, if you ever come across the naysayers in the market or the pushback people, where they say, "Oh, this is never going to work." And to your point, Clint, that there are other needs that could be more apparently pressing than investing in this. I mean, Clint, what do you see for naysayers and pushback?
Well, I'll just throw it out there that I've been framed as a naysayer, someone pushing back, even though I love aviation and I really want this to succeed. Sometimes just bringing up what I've just brought up to you, can be perceived by some as just a naysayer, because I'm not just jumping on the bandwagon with the current wave of hype, And so I think with that, we can look at different communities, and again, I'll point back to Utah just because it's so fresh in my head. A few years ago when we asked the communities about this, it was, not only no, but, a much stronger version of no. and, and we just recently did a community survey, a handful of months ago, and the narrative has changed, and that, that's credit to the education, to the involvement of not just the public sector stakeholders, but also the private sector stakeholders and the champions that are out there, and so we have a mix of, private industry representatives. We got a mix of government, that are very forward-looking, legislature that's forward-looking, and a nonprofit, that's helping the industry, pull the industry side together, and that whole concerted effort, has created a noticeable change in the outlook and perception of what this technology can do. And I think it's a very positive momentum. And so going back, that education, that common lexicon and all those things, is important early on.
You think, I saw you nod when I mentioned naysayers. You must have a couple of those around.
I work for a traditional planning agency, so of course we do. What I say is, when we're trying to weigh priorities, oftentimes people are like, why are we spending our public funding on this? Which, again, just to quickly say back to the pitfalls of planning for AAM funding, I would be remiss not to mention funding as it, right? Funding is a primary concern for all jurisdictional partners. I don't care who you are or where you're coming from. it's a massive issue. So that being said, with my messaging for naysayers, it's the technology is coming whether we're prepared or not. So we better get prepared, and we have to do so responsibly, because if we want to make sure that we're ahead of the technology, then we need to be preparing for it yesterday. And so oftentimes, people will say, "Oh, well, this is this or that is that." We saw this with the scooter rollouts. We've seen it with rideshare programs. We've seen it over and over and over again. And I'm sure when vehicles were rolled out, people were like, "No way, that's going to make it to the market." And then people had to go and retroactively urban plan around the streets that have already been, planned. And so for me, the way that I say it is, we can either use this technology to make our region better, and we can make sure that we're preparing responsibly and that we are taking a look at the best siting infrastructure, at making sure that our communities are well prepared and we're ready to ingest, that we are responsibly using federal or, all funding, not federal funding, but all funding opportunities that come down the pipeline to responsibly prepare our region for this technology. Or we can miss the boat, and then our technology providers will dictate where they're going to go. And so I think that with that, oftentimes it's they still might look at me like I'm crazy, but that's okay, because everyone who is an innovator is a little crazy.
So it sounds like you have a relatively softer approach as opposed to going and saying, we have to do this. You're basically saying, here are all the things we didn't do during, say scooters or whatever. So you can do that again and be fools, or and not be prepared, or we can prepare. Do they then come around?
Sometimes, especially when you start to see things like on TV or news announcements that are coming down the pipeline. Like, again, these technology providers, they're going after what's best for their business model. But if we make it easier to work with them and to work with our region and have our own partners prepared to have the conversations, it's going to make their lives easier for ingesting the technology as well. It's going to make their lives easier for knowing where they can go. And so the way that I view my role here in San Diego is to help everyone prepare to have the conversations, to make sure that our infrastructure is up to date, right? We want to make sure that we're not taking away from other opportunities, but we're creating a toolkit for all of our jurisdictional partners to be ready to have the conversations and well equipped to know what's going to work best for their own priorities and addressing the concerns that they have for their communities.
You've got Joby and Arch are two of the biggest air taxi companies in California. Clint, you're dealing in Utah. I mean, things are happening here in Florida. How do you look at this by region? Do you in San Diego, do you say, well, look what they're doing over there, and then in Utah, do you say, well, look what they're doing over there, or do you really just stay in your own market?
So California is interesting. I don't think that it's going to come as a surprise that it's a little bit more difficult to operate in California for numerous reasons, right? We also, on top of having NEPA, we have CEQA. So when you start to look at, again, land use compatibility and environmental, these are things that start to play into people's decision to operate. That being said, we also have a fairly viable market most days of the year. So to be able to operate and make sure that you can, again, have your business model sustainable throughout the year, people want to come to California. That being said, we don't always make it super easy to work alongside. We also have a ton of other jurisdictional partners that have to be considered. So we have the state government that, you have to think about CARB and which is our Air Resources Board. You have to think about the Transportation Commission. So there are certain things that go on there. And then we also have people like the DoD and the Department of Homeland Security who operate in our airspace. And it becomes a lot more to think about when you're just trying to get off the ground, right? They're just trying to do demonstrations. People are just trying to make sure that they can do the data collection necessary to see what's going to be able to make their business opportunity scalable. So for us, it's again trying to make sure that we are harmonizing all of those initiatives, bringing people along, but also being realistic in the way that we're approaching things. And so we are more a stay in your lane, but also let's not spend and waste taxpayers' dollars by not learning the lessons from the other jurisdictions, right? And I can just say, if I may, I also did consulting for a little while, and I have witnessed a lot of jurisdictions spend a lot of money on ground-based infrastructure or the idea of doing air corridors or something to that effect. And I think that's a super exciting approach, but maybe not as pragmatic as people thought it was going to be. And so for me, it's like, let's responsibly start the planning process, but not overindulge in where we think it's going to go. Let's take the lessons learned from other jurisdictions while also making sure that it's applicable to what we're working in and who we're working around. So again, balance, a delicate balance.
Yeah, very good. And Clint, what about? I mean, you're dealing with Utah as well as other places. Are they looking at? Hey, we want to get some of these air taxi things in, and then you say, well, how are they going to handle the snow in the winter? I mean, are those kind of issues or not?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. There are issues, and I think you know it's probably one of the follies that we want to avoid. Is characterizing an entire state by the state outlook. A state is comprised of many counties that have a different way of thinking and a different perspective and different priorities. That county is consisted of multiple jurisdictions that have their own unique look at the world and view on the world, and that it all comes down to the people. And so we want to make sure, and sometimes it's the only way we can talk about it, saying, what is Utah doing? What is Michigan doing? What is Louisiana doing? But we also have to keep remember in our back of our minds that, that state is comprised of, many other, jurisdictions that may not see things, eye to eye, at the state level. And it's also something important to, I think look at is depending on who you're talking to, they have a different outlook. So I can give the same presentation, to a group of city officials. The economic developers are going to take a different message from that conversation than the transportation planners are. And the transportation planners are going to take a different look at that message than the land use planners are, because they each have a different policy lever, that they're trying to manipulate that's guided, by the policies that they have, as well as the funding mechanisms and where that funding's coming from that might have stipulations on how they work and engage with this space. And so it's important to recognize, that if you're going to go to a city and they're leaning forward on their economic development front, well, then it's probably privy for you to understand, what are the economic developers really worried about and what authority do they ultimately have in creating policy and guiding ordinance around this, and that's led us, in some places to look and get more familiar with the Economic Development Administration and EDA grants and how they're administered, and what equates to a winning grant application versus a losing grant application, and calibrate those conversations, to that end. If you're talking about, an MPO, that's doing a regional transportation plan, knowing that, a majority of their funding comes from FHWA, some from FTA, and some from local, fuel sales taxes or something like that. It doesn't give them a whole lot of latitude to work with aviation solutions because the FAA ultimately isn't giving money to them to work on this kind of stuff. But most transportation authorities have a carve out for some kind of disruptive transportation technology they're able to explore this stuff through, and that's how they want to spend it. Now you get down to the land use planners. They're dealing with a whole different, bucket of funds and concerns. Some of that or a lot of that is dictated by city council, coming from the general fund that's allocated to them, and they get very specific priorities and projects that they're supposed to work on. And so it's much harder to frame something, such as a disruptive technology bucket, to pursue studies on this. They have to get a motion from their city council to say, hey, we see this coming. We see that it has either value or is a threat to our community, and we need you to study it through that lens, and that may be, where the rubber really meets the road is with the land use planners, with the prospect of much of this being either privately developed or developed through a public-private partnership. It becomes much more a land use issue than it does a transportation issue, despite, the intuitive way that we typically think about those buckets.
You've both been very prescriptive and very insightful in terms of how to approach this. What should areas watch out for? We told them what they should probably do. What do they need? What are some of the big? Make sure you don't do this. Kate, what do you see as some of the look out fors?
Don't think that this technology is coming 30 years down the pipeline where you can start the planning process in a couple of years. I think that a lot of people maybe don't understand how much planning goes into just doing traditional transportation planning. Something just for a highway can take 40 years to plan, right? And so by not starting the planning process today, by not really understanding the components that are going to be necessary to undertake, we're doing ourselves a disservice because we spend a lot of money on our planning initiatives for everything. And if you're not really looking at this technology as part of your more holistic planning initiatives, you're going to miss the boat in being able to make sure that you and your region are prepared or your jurisdiction is prepared. I'd also say that, again, kind of going back to the ownership conversation, making sure you know and your region is comfortable with where that ownership sits and who is going to take on what, I think is just very critical, because a lot of places might wait for someone else to come down the pipeline and say, we'll just wait for the technology providers to do it. And you don't necessarily want that to happen, because again, if you're not prepared, you're going to miss the boat. And I think the very last thing that I'd say about kind of the missteps that could really kind of impede your integration initiatives is making sure that you understand back to the priorities. Like, again, we're not innovating for innovation's sake. You're innovating to solve something. This has to provide a solution for something, right? We're not just gonna, people talk about darkening the skies, or that's been a concern in the past when you have conversations with the public, right? You want to make sure that at the end of the day, you have a very well understood value add that you're going to bring to that community, because at the end of the day, you don't want to displace communities. You don't want to make communities feel like they're being left out of the technology. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to see how this technology can enhance your lived experience. And by creating access, by getting ahead of the technology, you're going to be able to do that.
Briefly, Clint, before we go to questions, what do you see as, you see timing as the big issue that people need to watch out or be aware of, or something different?
Yeah, I think the timing is something of critical importance. I don't think people appreciate how long policy development actually takes. An example that I often give is in a large metropolitan jurisdiction that is known for being a little bit contentious, had a voter demanded mandate to create regulations around cannabis dispensaries. That was something that was demanded. It still took 7 years, to create that policy, to make that possible. And so right now, monitoring across the country, there aren't a whole lot of large jurisdictions where voters are demanding, attention to be paid to advance their mobility. And so if we look at, and granted, cannabis regulation is very complicated, and there's a lot of, pitfalls to navigate in that. So I want to recognize that too. But the point being, that this kind of stuff takes time. And also, again, depending on the pathway that you're trying to enable, whether it be public-private partnership, public development, or fully private development, that also, injects nuance into the timing aspect of it all. And so, again, I think, the one thing to work on to mitigate those is, again, listening and figuring out, on the community side, what are we doing today? What are the pain points today? What are our aspirations in the future? And then the other pitfall I want, to avoid is that, and again, love the eVTOL air taxi, and grateful for where they brought us on here, but advanced air mobility is not just eVTOL air taxis. There are so many other different technologies, aircraft types, use cases, missions, and so forth that fall under that advanced air mobility umbrella, that can solve some of the problems that communities have, and so we want to make sure that we're looking at this holistically from what do we need to solve our problems, not we want this specific technology.
Why the AAMA exists. Chuck Salvo, you have some questions you've been gathering for us here. We got a few minutes for questions.
Actually, we don't have any on the chart, but I'd love to see if they're open up to the crowd and see if utilizing the chat. Is there any questions out there? Or you're welcome to unmute and ask a question. We're a small enough group, but large enough and small enough. Any questions?
There was one about, does zoning laws often have to be changed?
Okay.
Kate, you're dealing with laws.
I think as of right now, I'm sure that in the future we'll have to address it. But as of right now, I think that again with this, we're not to scale. I think they're going to need to be more demonstrable understanding, and people really understanding the data and how this is impacting our communities before we have to take a look at the way that zoning is going to be maybe enhanced or creating more opportunity. But I think as of today, like, it's more a wait and see, because you don't want to unnecessarily zone something. But AAM is not going to be unique in this, right? I think that this is going to really be transit-oriented development might change the way that we look at zoning, stuff like that. So I think that there are realities that probably yes in the future, but it's more of a wait and see.
You must deal with that.
Yeah, and I'd jump onto that and just say also it depends on what state you're in, and so I'm for the land use planners that might be in the room, I might screw this up, so please, correct me and I won't feel bad, but if we want to summarize it, you got two different flavors of states. You got home rule states, and then you got Dillon rule states. And the Dillon rule states means that if it's not in your land use allowance tables, in your zoning regulations, then it's not allowed. And then the home rule is the opposite. So if you live in one of those states where it has to be defined, a land use has to be defined in your allowance tables, then yes, you do need absolutely to address some of this new technology in your zoning and development ordinances. If it's a home rule state, then it's a different ballgame and it's a little bit more complicated. And I don't want to get into what that might look like, but you can get started on it now, and there are different pathways. And I think one of the big things that a big win on the infrastructure side is that vertiports are now being looked at as a subclass of heliports, which kind of streamlines some of that as well. But there are also some pitfalls where that doesn't solve everything. So if we look at certain municipalities' conditional use permits that are assigned to heliports today, they specifically say this facility is allowing a helicopter to land X amount of times a day with certain conditions assigned to it. Now the legal look is does that word helicopter mean that an eVTOL cannot operate there? Because the conditional use permit is very prescriptive in what can and cannot be happen there. So some states might want to go and look at that and get their legal teams on that to see can we allow eVTOLs to operate at this facility, knowing that our conditional use permits specifically state helicopters. And again, it goes back to those terms. Is an eVTOL a helicopter? Is a vertiport a heliport? And making sure we understand what that looks like, at least within the codes that's guiding the discussion here.
We've got Kate and Clint as like the A team of this whole market. It's great. You guys are terrific. We could probably talk. You have so much knowledge in there. We'll have to have another session. The AAMA is an independent organization. It's a nonprofit, and we're trying to help the community basically learn and understand. There are no biases. We have no vested interest in any of this other than helping cities advance. To get information on AAMA, it's aamax.org. That's aamax.org. I encourage you to go. And Kate and Clint, thank you so much. You've been fantastic. And thank you all for watching and listening. And keep tracking the AAMA.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Yes, this is fantastic.